All right. And we're just waiting a couple of seconds or minutes until we get this started. So when that people are able to come in, just giving it one more minute. And let's just kick things off. Well, hello, everyone. I am glad that you all join us today for our first webinar of the year 2024. And I hope that you all had a fantastic start to the new year. And last year, we talked a lot about the new FTC and FDA regulations and how this affects brands. I think by now we all understand what's important and what brands have to do. And the most important thing is that every brand, when making claims, has to have the right substantiation for those claims. Also, the recent industry report published by McKinsey mentioned that clinical is now more important than the word clean, and consumers are demanding clinically proven products, and brands can achieve that by conducting third-party research studies, for example, with Citruslabs. And today we will talk about a big topic, which is budget. And research studies or clinical trials and even consumer perception studies cost money. And today is all about how to budget for your clinical trial or perception study. And we will dive into how much a study costs, what to pay attention to in terms of budgeting, and also what pitfalls to avoid. In case you don't know who I am, my name is Susanne Mitschke, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Citruslabs. And Citruslabs is the fastest growing provider of clinical trials for brands. And we work with supplements, superfoods, cosmetics, and devices. And the end product of a clinical study is typically a substantiated product claim. And if you're interested in conducting your own research, you can contact us at hello@citruslabs.com. and can visit us at www.citruslabs.com. And as always, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box of Zoom or in the chat, and we will answer your questions at the end of the webinar. Today, I am joined by one of our Citruslabs team members, our Director of Partnerships, Travis Proctor. Travis, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today and telling us a little bit more about budgeting for clinical studies.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me on. Just so all of you know, if any of you do reach out to us after this webinar, you're likely going to see me again. So pleasure to be here. And yeah, my name's Travis Proctor. I'm the Director of Partnerships here at Citruslabs. I've been with Citruslabs for about 4.5 years now. Come from a pretty heavy operations and sales background, many years of experience working in the medical industry. Previously worked for a company called Patient Pop. Some of you might have heard of that. My role here at Citruslabs is mainly to help our customers set up their clinical trial. I want to make sure, when we're setting it up, that it meets all of their needs, but also we, always need to make sure we're fitting that into a specific budget, right? Because a lot of times it's not an endless budget. We need to make sure we fit that trial into a very specific budget. Have a lot of experience working with newer brands, helping them pair studies with, product launches. Some of those newer brands are, Cardone, a men's skincare company, Dame Products as well. And then also a lot of experience working with some of those larger brands you might have been familiar with as well, Hum Nutrition, Supergut, and Factor, working with them to set up much larger clinical trials, more of the randomized controlled placebo trials, placebo-controlled trials with biomarkers and all sorts of fun things involved.
Awesome. Thank you, Travis. And to start, I quickly wanted to talk about different study designs because these study designs can impact the budget of your research project. And one study design that you are likely familiar with is the randomized control trial, often referenced as the gold standard of clinical studies, and short version of that is RCT. For example, a double-blind placebo-controlled study is part of an RCT. Double-blind placebo-controlled means that the study involves the actual intervention, the test product, and a placebo, and that neither the study participant nor the researcher knows which product is the actual intervention and which one is the placebo. And this study design often involves biomarkers, which are objective ways to collect data. For example, blood work, stool markers like microbiome testing or skin analysis. I think in recent months, we have also seen a lot of skin microbiome and scalp microbiome, for example, or hair testing. And you can also include smart trackers like Fitbit, Oura Rings, Whoop bands, smart scales to get more data, also more objective data. And one study design that falls under an RCT is a crossover study in which you have only one study group, but this group is also their own placebo or control. So the same group will take the actual product and the placebo, or will go through control phase. And then we have also a true single group study. They are often referred to as pilot studies. Here you have one study group, there's no control group, there's no placebo group, and you have repeat measurements to compare baseline and endline to see if there was an effect. And ideally, single group studies also involve biomarkers to make them more robust. And then we have perception studies. This is a study type that we almost exclusively see in cosmetics, and skincare and hair care, for example, often use this study type. It's not very scientific, and it's not a clinical trial. And if you do conduct a perception study, you should not mark it as a clinical trial, but in fact a perception study. And this is typically questionnaire-based, and perception studies don't include any objective data measurements from biomarkers or from trackers, but can absolutely involve, for example, before and after photos. And if you decide to work with Citruslabs, we customize every study to our client's specific goals and needs and budget. And we don't follow a one-size-fits-all approach. We conduct all of these study types, from very complex multi-arm randomized controlled trials to crossover studies to single group studies to perception studies. All right, now enough background information. Travis, now that we learned about these different study designs, can you tell us a little bit more how the cost of these trials vary for these different designs?
Yeah, so of course, cost is going to be the number one topic question every time I get on a call with everyone. Where everyone always wants to know, how much does it cost, right? So for us, we don't, as Susanne mentioned, we don't provide a one-size-fits-all approach, and our pricing is always going to be very unique to the requirements of the specific study we're working on. Cost of the clinical trial, I'd say especially when working with us, the cost is going to be affected most by the number of participants in your study. That's going to be the number one driver of cost for any study when you're working with us. The next mover, I'm going to say biomarkers. If you do decide to involve like blood work, microbiome, anything to that effect, that's always going to affect a couple different things, as well as the cost of the testing, which can be expensive. Blood work's going to be a little less. Microbiome's going to be on the more expensive side. And then the involvement of any type of, data tracking, Fitbit, sleep trackers, smart scales, any sort of device you want to incorporate in the study as well to gather a little more objective data. That will, of course, affect the cost as much, not quite as much as a biomarker, but it does move that cost up and down. Also, the involvement of validated scales and questionnaires that might have to be licensed out, that could also have a great effect on your cost. Sometimes those licensing fees can be quite steep. What type of study you conduct is also going to come down to your scientific rigor. Consumer perception studies are typically mainly found, as Susanne mentioned, in the cosmetic industry. They're most cost-efficient version of creating claims, but they also are, as she mentioned, the least scientific. But then depending on the types of claims you want to make, this might be a great option for you. I do often recommend this as a first step if you've never run a study on your product before. This can be a great step to get some good initial data for your new product, something to that effect. Clinical trials are typically divided into like gold standard randomized controlled trials and single group clinical trials. The thing that a single group trial is packed with biomarkers and trackers can be more expensive than an RCT that is only questionnaire based. So that does contradict the number of participants a little bit, but if you do build out a super robust single group clinical trial, it can definitely run up the price tag a little bit. Fortunately, we do see a lot more RCTs for supplements. And the good thing is that there is also a study design called a crossover study, which Susanne touched on. This does take a little bit longer to actually execute, but they're definitely more cost efficient. And it's still part of the RCT family. I think it's a great tool to use because with an RCT, you typically have, two different people. You have a control group, intervention group, two different people doing two different things. With the crossover, you have that one participant completing both parts of the trial. So I think you get a really good set of data there. It's a little more economical version for brands. If you don't want to conduct an RCT or you don't quite have that budget, the crossover study is a great option for you.
Awesome. And as you know, some researcher also believe that crossover studies are like better than two-arm studies, because what Travis mentioned, that you are comparing your product and a placebo in the same participant.
I agree with that. I think you get a little more truer set of data when you have that one person going through both parts of the trial versus having two different people go through two different parts of the study, right? It is the gold standard, but in my opinion, I do think you almost get a little truer set of data from a crossover study.
All right. And when you conduct a study, then there are obviously different phases involved. And when I mean phases, I don't mean, like in a track trial, phase 1, 2, 3, 4, but I mean like study setup phase, execution, data collection. And Travis, can you tell us a little bit more what the typical costs are that are associated with each phase of a clinical trial?
Yeah, so without giving actual dollars and cents of what it would cost, so we do have what we call study startup costs. This would include everything from designing your study, creating your protocol, picking the right validated scales and questionnaires to apply to your study, creating the study specific questions as well, and then of course submitting to the IRB for approval. Then you have the actual costs of the IRB, so we do have to pay to have them actually review and approve your study. Recruitment costs, so you have the costs of recruiting the actual participants for your study, right? Then we do have to have a management cost because we want to make sure those participants are adhering to your protocol during the course of the study. And then you also want to make sure you do compensate the participants for their time and their effort participating in your trial. Then there's also the costs of data collection, data analysis. That's a huge part of clinical trials, right? Because what are the trials without the data? Then, of course, there's a cost of actually writing that clinical study report. Now, some of those more optional costs, you can, as we've talked about so far, you can look at the biomarkers, you can look at trackers. Some of those things do add, of course, additional cost to your study. And then when we move into cosmetics, you can also potentially look at site-based studies for cosmetics. A lot of studies, they do want to use instrumentation, Visia camera, things like that. On our end, in decentralized ways, we can do tool, we can do skin grading, we can use a corneometer and a cutometer. So we do have all those tools we can use, but of course, they all are things you do need to build into your budget because they do come with specific costs.
Absolutely. And when even like with some of our clients that are a little bit bigger and that conducted studies before conducting studies with us, we all heard like these nightmare stories that, okay, so I went with these guys and then they gave me a budget, and then 2 weeks later the budget almost doubled. So Travis, do you sometimes see, any unexpected costs or expenses when it comes to these studies?
So for me, my number one goal when I'm helping a customer set up a study is to try and make sure something like that does not happen, which I've luckily gotten very good at. But sometimes when you start designing a study and our research team starts working on a study, they can make certain suggestions or provide options to produce specific claims depending on your endpoints, right? And so sometimes these can be add-ons, biomarkers, things like that make your study more robust. And sometimes this will happen during that study design process. And this, if you do opt for those things, that could, of course, increase the cost of your study, right? But the good news is here, this isn't something you're going to be forced to pay for, right? This would be something you choose as an option to add onto your study. So it's not going to be something that necessarily pops up out of the blue for you. It would just be an added cost that you maybe weren't planning for, but hey, you decide, you know what, I think it's worth it to do this. But once a study is actually finalized, the materials are created, our customers signed off saying, hey, this looks good. We go through that IRB approval process. Once we start executing the study, everything will be as expected, right? I have yet to see a scenario where one of our customers, you know, during the study process, all of a sudden had a bunch of unexpected costs come up. I really try hard to make sure that once we're running the study, everyone knows exactly what they're going to have to pay for.
That's great. I think I can think of one scenario, Travis, but it has nothing to do with us. It's more like production,
Yeah.
speeding up, right? Speeding up to get the product, and then, you know, maybe paying extra to the manufacturer to actually get product and placebo, for example, faster.
Also, one scenario that did pop up now that you just mentioned that, I do know we had a customer that maybe had to do some testing on their product before they actually ran the study they didn't know about beforehand. So that's a very rare scenario, but it is something that's popped up. But again, it's super, super rare.
Yeah. And what do you think are the key factors that influence budgeting of a clinical trial?
So number one is definitely going to be your goals, your objectives, the types of claims you want to make, right? Because what your goals are and the types of claims you want to make are going to be very dependent on how we set up the study. Do we need to involve biomarkers? What are the different things we're going to add on? Of course, the regulatory environment is going to be a factor as well. You can conduct a perception study and then create health claims. You can't do that though. So if you do want to create health claims, you have to run an actual clinical trial.
Yeah, and I also think, you know, part of budgeting is also thinking about ROI.
Yeah,
And I think it's important that brands also, you know, define their ROI early
absolutely.
on. And to me, you know, sometimes it's mind blowing that brands have terrific results, but they are not using them. And
Yes.
you have to keep in mind, you know, that while we provide you with even some marketing inspiration, you will also get a bunch of marketing assets from us. But you still, you know, we don't have access to your website, so we can't put it on your website or on your social media channels, right? So while we provide you with, you know, some marketing help, you then have to implement that. And, you know, this is also part of, you know, what you have to budget for. Like once the study is completed, you have to use your results ideally, because otherwise, why would you do a study in the first place?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And Travis, you love to work with like small indie brands,
Mhm.
and obviously you also work with some larger companies that have, you know, deeper pockets. But I know that you're very passionate in helping specifically small brands out and making it work for small brands. So what are these strategies to optimize the budget without compromising the quality of the study?
So one thing I think a lot of people do is they potentially look at other studies that have been conducted by other companies on similar products, and they think they potentially need to do everything that company did in their study, which typically isn't going to be the case, right? A lot of these things are optional. So as an example, sometimes companies will look at testing, as we've talked about several times here, measuring biomarkers, different things in the blood, the microbiome, whatever that may be. When it comes to the biomarkers, every once in a while, you'll have someone, for example, that wants to measure, now I'll just use some arbitrary markers here, but something like an HSCRP, which is an inflammatory marker, and IL-6, which is also an inflammatory marker. So there wouldn't really be a reason to test both of these in the same study because you're looking at very similar data from the two. So something like that, hey, let's only test one instead of testing both, right? So reduce your biomarkers and make sure the biomarkers you're actually testing for are going to produce some type of result for you, right? You don't want to just test a bunch of things to test them, right? You actually want to test them with purpose. Also, less time points for your biomarkers. sometimes people want to do like, say you have a 3-month study and they want to do biomarkers at baseline, midline, and endline. That midline point probably isn't going to provide you a lot of data. So let's just take that midpoint measurement out and let's do baseline and endline. That's going to save you cost on the testing. It's going to save you cost on the participant compensation as well. So things like that to kind of cut down your data measurements is going to help. You're still going to have a lot of robust data, but you just might not have all the different time points. And at the end of the day, what's the most important thing? The baseline measurement and the endline measurement, right? The endline result is going to be what you want the most. And then also, if you do want to conduct a placebo-controlled study, you don't necessarily have to run that randomized controlled trial, right? We can look at the crossover study and we can design that will save you some money when you are designing a clinical trial.
Yeah. And just for clarification, so crossover study is still a randomized control study. It's just not 2 arms. It's just basically, 1 arm, but they go through both the product, your product, and the placebo or the control group, for example.
And one of the reasons it's more cost efficient is because, like we mentioned at the beginning, one of the biggest things that's going to affect the cost of your study is the number of participants. And we can do crossover studies with less participants than we need for 2-arm studies, 2-arm randomized control trials.
Yep. And when a small company wants to conduct a clinical study, how can they approach, the budgeting with limited finances? And what solutions have you seen in the past couple of years?
So I would say number one is you want to plan your clinical trial ahead of time, right? You don't want to try and cram something into like 2 or 3 months before a product launch where you absolutely are depending on having results right away. You want to give yourself in maybe a 6-month or build it into the yearly budget, something like that. You just don't want to try and squish it into a short amount of time. That is going to cost more money, of course. We've also seen some clients utilize R&D tax credits or research grants to get funding for their trials. So the research grants, we've worked with a lot of companies that have got research grants. That's a super, super popular way for people to be able to fund their clinical trial. But also you can talk to your CRO. A lot of CROs do offer startup-friendly payment options. So, we necessarily might not require everything up front. You could break up the payments a little bit during the course of the study. There are a lot of options like that out there that allow you to not have to pay a huge chunk of change right up front.
And are there any pitfalls that brands should avoid?
I would say choose a study design you can afford, right? That kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier, where some companies will see a competitor ran a certain type of study. Maybe it was a site-based study with, they spent probably $500,000, maybe $1 million on their study. And now you want to duplicate that might not be necessary. So definitely choose a study design you can afford. And then also you really don't want to, a lot of times when people want to reduce the budget, one of the first things they reduce is the participant compensation. So you do want to avoid that if possible, just because participant compensation can affect your retention. And if we reduce it too much, that retention can get a little tricky in keeping the participants in your study.
And I think one additional pitfall that is not so much, tied to budgeting, but it also somehow is transparency. So, Travis mentioned that choose a study design that you can afford. So if you can afford a single group study, but maybe with, 60, 70 participants, but can't afford a 300-person randomized control study, then that's fine. But don't mark it as, don't put it on your website and have some language around, that consumers could read this as, oh, that was actually, randomized control study. Make it very clear that this was a single group clinical study, that this is your first step in your clinical study journey, and that you have other studies planned. And one thing that I think is great with single group studies, because they are pilot studies, is that you can have like so many learnings from these, studies as well. Because sometimes when you start off with a randomized control study, you might not exactly know how, biomarkers will be affected by your product, for example. And then you can spend money on that and spend a lot of money on it and might not have the results you wanted. So with a, pilot study, you actually tee up your your bigger randomized control study. So that should also not be forgotten. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Travis.
I would say I pretty much always recommend brands to not start with a randomized control trial as your first study. I think, and honestly, the pharma space, they follow that same format, right? When they introduce products, they don't start with that randomized control trial, they ramp up to it. So I will pretty much always recommend that same approach for brands. Start with the smaller single group study first, unless you do have some data already, and then see what kind of data you get back from that to use to build your next larger study after that.
Yeah. Yeah. If you have data already, then, it's a no-brainer. We
Yeah,
can start immediately with an RCT, right? But if you are just launching, I think a smaller pilot study makes
thanks.
more sense. And if you want to use the results from that, just be very transparent about it. Include number of participants, include the study type, maybe include even some of the inclusion, exclusion, or even link to your clinicaltrials.gov page.
Absolutely.
All right. And Travis, do you think that technology also plays a role in reducing clinical trial costs?
Absolutely. And that's exactly what we do, right? We use our technology to help reduce those clinical trial costs and specialize in conducting decentralized studies. They're definitely more cost efficient. And I mean, I know we're talking about budget a lot, but not only are they more cost efficient, they're definitely a lot more time efficient as well. But then you can also, some other options is to look at home administration of different instruments. One of the things we use for a lot of studies where like they're looking at cognitive endpoints is something called cognitive battery testing. It's a great gold standard test that's not going to blow your budget out of the water, but can provide you with really good gold standard objective data. And then also you can look at home biomarker sample collection. There's some great options for that as well. We've utilize several of those options for our studies. And those are great ways to kind of pull your study out of the research site, which does often come with a higher price tag, and run that decentralized trial. So those are some great options to reduce that budget and still hit all the different data points you're looking to hit.
And then I think recruitment can also have a big impact on clinical trial budgets, right?
Yes, and I think this goes a lot into study design. So, of course, everyone always wants to select a very, they want to select the right inclusion exclusion criteria for their study participants, right? They want to have that ideal study participant in their study so they can get that data they want. But the thing is, you really don't want to be too restrictive when creating that inclusion exclusion criteria. I've seen it, especially in the pharma space, I've seen it several times where basically a criteria is created that you just can't simply go find that person, right? And if you do, it's going to take 6 months to a year to recruit the participants. So really think about what you need in that criteria, but don't make it so restrictive that you're looking for a unicorn to recruit, essentially. And keep burden on the participants at a minimum without sacrificing study rigor, right? You want to try and ask almost the least amount of the study participants as you can, because that's the best way to keep adherence high, is minimize the burden on the study participant.
Absolutely. And then one thing we should also talk about very briefly is ROI, return on investment. So as a contract research organization, CRO, that Citruslabs is, we would assume that our success is measured by planning and executing a high quality study. But obviously our clients put an ROI on the study and the results as well. Did the study move the needle in terms of revenue, additional customers, retail listings? So how can brands actually measure their ROI for their clinical trials?
So some of the things that I've talked to brands about are, better website conversions. That's a big thing, because a lot of our brands are selling heavily online. So better website conversions is going to be a big factor for you. Better ad conversions as well. When you are able to use these clinical trial results in your ads, social media ads, wherever you are advertising, we do see better ad conversions typically as well, because results do drive those conversions. And then a big one that I know a lot of the brands we've worked with is it's easier to get into those retailers. You have an easier time talking to those retailers. They do tend to take brands more seriously when they do have like actually clinically trial or clinical backed results for their product. So that's a big thing, is it does really help when you are trying to get into those big box retailers.
Amazing. And I think that concludes our short chat about budgeting for clinical trials. I hope that was helpful, and I would also like to give you, the audience, some time to ask any questions, and please put your questions in the Q&A box. And while you type your questions, I quickly wanted to let you know about our next workshop on February 15th at 10 a.m. Pacific time, where we discuss best practices in supplement clinical trials. And I am joined by one of our wonderful principal investigators, Dr. Swathi Varanasi, a workshop that you certainly should not miss. And if you are interested in conducting clinical studies, you can reach out to us at either hello@citruslabs.com, or you can contact Travis directly at travis@citruslabs.com. And now let's answer some questions. So first question is, do you help with the IRB approval? Yes, we do that. We have a bunch of IRBs that we work with. And I think turnaround time, Travis?
Usually 2 to 3 weeks, which I mean, for IRB approval, if you're familiar with that, you know that process can be super long and painstaking. So yeah, usually about a 2 to 3 week turnaround time on the IRB approval, which is super fast.
Then we have a question on storage. Can blood acids be kept to be used with other biomarker add-ons in the future? No, that is unfortunately not possible. We don't store biomarkers. This is typically something that you would see in an academic setting. But if you have a partner that, stores blood samples, we can absolutely get these samples to the partner, and then they can store it and can use it in the future. This is how some of our clients have approached this. Okay, then who selects the quality of the researchers and the publishers conducting the study? So I think there are a bunch of things mixed in that question. So publishing is separate. So obviously studies can get published in a journal, but I think Travis, correct me if I'm wrong, but most brands are not looking to get published. They are looking for claims. But with that being said, we have published studies in journals, but it's typically something that we see more from very sophisticated brands that are more going towards even like biotech.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'd say probably the vast majority of the brands we work with really aren't interested in publishing. They're really just looking for results for their product. But if you do want to take it kind of to that next level and get published, we can definitely assist with that. And also, just to throw this out there, if you are considering publishing, you probably want to go the randomized controlled trial route. It is usually, as we mentioned, the gold standard. So you usually have a better chance of getting published there.
And then one very interesting question is, who owns responsibility of the FTC challenging something in the study? So the thing is, that stuff happens. This is why lawyers exist. And this is something that typically a law counsel would take on. We actually do work with a bunch of regulatory counsels. They are amazing counsels out there. And that's their responsibility to defend in case of FTC challenging, because we, as a CRO, we know how to conduct research, but obviously FTC is a different beast. So this is why we always recommend any claims that you make, you actually get these claims approved by your counsel. If you don't have a regulatory counsel, we can recommend regulatory counsels to actually get help with phrasing your claims for your website. Awesome. Any other questions? All right. Well, if there are no more questions, then thank you so much for joining us today. Again, our next workshop is on February 15th with Dr. Swathi Varanasi, one of our principal investigators. and we talk about best practices for supplement clinical trials. You can just scan the QR code here, and the workshop will be super helpful in order to think through your study design, methodologies, and also study execution. And I hope that you have a great rest of your day, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you guys.